Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Paul Dodds. I've got the pleasure of being the chair of this conference, and I'm really excited to welcome you all today. We've got a really amazing lineup, and it's very exciting. UKIRK in the past has had an annual conference for the last few years, but we haven't had one since the COVID. And so this is the first event for several years. It's the first time we've had a hybrid conference, which is very exciting as well. So we have quite a number of people online. You'll see all the cameras at the back and such like. And that's going to change a little bit how we work compared to conferences pre-COVID. First of all, I can say a little bit about UKIRK. So UKIRK is an interdisciplinary research center. We focus on transitions to sustainable energy systems, and we've been in operation since 2004. It has a hub at University College London, but its members are from universities from across the UK. It's primarily a research organization, but we also look to support energy researchers and decision makers from across the community. We run a series of events. And our current mission is new challenges and opportunities for implementing the transition to a net zero energy system. This research conference, the topic for this research conference, the topic is putting net zero into action, addressing the implementation gap. So the net zero strategy was published late last year. I think it's fair to say it had a mixed reception. It was the first time the UK had a plan in order to meet net zero, but it had mixed reception for both the quality and the breadth of that plan. There was a judicial review, which was heard in court last week over a perceived lack of firm commitment, and I'm very pleased that our first keynote speaker was one of the people involved in that judicial review. And at this conference, we want to think about what are the strengths and the weaknesses of the strategy, and what are the next steps going to be. And so we have quite a number of sessions looking at various aspects of the transition towards net zero as part of the conference. We're going to start off with a keynote speech from Niall, Toru of Friends of the Earth, and then later on today we'll have Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, who are going to give their views. Then we have a number of sessions. So this morning we will talk about the global energy crisis. We also have sessions on power decarbonisation, the public sector, energy and transport equity, and the cost and benefits of decarbonisation. That's all today. And then tomorrow we'll talk about energy infrastructure needs, low energy demand opportunities, industry, unlocking innovation skills and supply chains, biomass and other environmental objectives, and then we'll finish off with a panel debate. So finally, I need to talk a little bit about the practicalities of running a hybrid conference. So for the first time this time, we're going to have all of the questions online, okay? So we're not going to take questions from the room because the people online wouldn't have a chance to get involved with that. And we have quite a number of people online today. So instead, you should have all received login information. You should have received an email from UKIRK this morning, from Jessica, and that had a link to the Glisser platform. And we're going to put questions on the Glisser platform. So if you look in the conference book, you can get the password for the Wi-Fi for this event. And then if you go onto Glisser, you can type your question. Please try to keep it quite short if you can, because we're going to show the questions on the screen, and if people write very, very long questions, then we won't be able to see many. Also on the Glisser platform, as well as being able to write questions, you can vote for the questions that you really like. And so session chairs will try and make a point of asking those questions which get a lot of votes. So please do get involved on the Glisser platform. As well as having questions, some speakers have also asked for some polls or questions to be displayed as part of the session. And so you'll be asked to, if you'd like to, if you go to a particular session, that poll will flash up and you can give your views. There's also going to be a couple of other things that pop up. So there's going to be an EDI form, Equality, Diversity, Inclusion. That's very important for UKIRK. If you fill that in, it won't take you very long. So we'd be very grateful if you could do so at some point during the conference. And there'll also be an evaluation form afterwards. I particularly need to talk about the poster session. So we have a poster session this afternoon, and we have a competition, which is great. We have a small number of posters in the competition. So all of the posters in the competition you can see on the Glisser platform. And most of the people who've done those posters have also done a 3-minute interview which you can see on the platform. But as well as doing that, you can see some posters at the end of this room for those who are in person. Those are the posters that are in the competition. Please do have a look at the posters, have a look at the videos if you can, and then we'd like you all to vote. And we're working on a Eurovision-style voting system here, so we have a panel who is going to vote, and we have the public who are going to vote, and we're going to put the votes together to decide who the winner is going to be. Okay? So please make time to do that during the day if you can. Finally, we do have the poster session at 4:10 this evening. And I'd like to invite, the posters are going to be through in the main room where we have lunch, so we can all have some drinks as well. And I'd like to invite any early career researchers who are presenting posters who are interested in giving a 2 to 3 minute talk on their poster to everybody to please tell us during the day. You can tell me or tell one of the UKirk staff, and then we'll make arrangements for that during the poster session. Okay? That's not limited to people who've been chosen to be the finalists in the competition. That's anybody who has a poster here. And there is a £200 book token prize for the winning poster. So please do. So there are big stakes here. So please do vote. The final things I need to tell you are practicalities for people who are in the room. So we have breakfast available tomorrow. We do have a breakfast session for early career researchers with people talking about their career path. We've got several speakers at various levels of their career path. But breakfast is available for anybody who wants to come from about 8:30, I think. And I think we start at 9. It must be available at 8 o'clock because that session starts at 8 o'clock, and then the conference itself will start at 9. We have 2 rooms. This is the main room that you're sitting in. The other room is going to be the survey room, not the Outlook room. And the survey room is on the other side of the building, so past the catering area. Okay? We also have a 3rd room called the Vista room, which you passed on your way to this room. And you can put bags there tomorrow if you wish. Okay? So that's a storage room. It's an extra room that we won't be using for anything else. If there's an emergency, please follow the emergency signs. And I think that's about it for the practicalities. So I'd like to now go on to our first keynote. I think Niall doesn't have any slides. I'm very pleased to welcome Niall Toru, who's come up here after being in court last week. He's a senior lawyer at Friends of the Earth, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. He specialises in climate change litigation and is a national rapporteur for the Sabin Centre of Climate Change Law, which is based at Columbia Law School. His current cases include opposing a planning application for the UK's first underground coal mine in over 30 years in Whitehaven, Cumbria. And he's also acting in claims against the UK government over its funding of a gas mega project in Mozambique and over the adequacy of the net zero strategy, which he's going to talk about today. And prior to joining Friends of the Earth, Niall was a senior lawyer in the government legal department, where he specialised in planning and infrastructure litigation, and in particular high-profile climate change cases. Niall, welcome.
Hello, thank you, Chair, and thank you to UKirk for inviting me. It's an honour to be here. Just give me 1 second to open my iPad. As Paul has said, my name is Niall Toru. I'm a lawyer at Friends of the Earth. Hopefully, most of you will heard of Friends of the Earth, but we are an environmental campaigning organisation. We're the largest grassroots organisation in the UK, and we have a presence in 74 countries spanning 6 continents. We campaign, and we do related things, as you've heard, like suing governments and suing corporations for the objective of protecting the planet and its inhabitants, and that includes, obviously, protecting the climate. Today's conference is about closing the implementation gap and putting net zero into action. In the UK, the main strategy to do that is the net zero strategy. This is economy-wide. It includes a range of proposals and policies for decarbonisation. Some of these are grouped by sector, such as transport, power, etc., and some are cross-cutting. Together, These policies and proposals will deliver the carbon budgets, which are our stepping stone towards net zero, or at least that's what the government tells us the strategy will do. The problem is it hasn't shown its workings. And in particular, and against advice from its own experts, it hasn't told us the predicted effects of the policies that are in the strategy, or when those effects will happen. And by effects, I mean a quantification of the expected reductions in emissions for each of the proposals and policies. How much will they save, and when will those savings occur? Without this information, we say it's impossible for MPs, for the public, for academics like yourselves, for NGOs and for others to judge whether the strategy is fit for purpose. And that purpose is to meet quantified emission reduction targets, ultimately net zero, but also the carbon budgets on the way to net zero. We're supposed to take it on trust from government that these policies will deliver, but that's not something they want us to be able to scrutinise in detail. This, you might think, is far from ideal for closing the implementation gap, particularly where key parts of the strategy are vague and high level. As well as being far from ideal, we say it's also unlawful, which is why we brought the government to court. We did it along with 2 other environmental NGOs, with Client Earth and with the Good Law Project. And last week, our claims were heard, which is fantastic timing, because a lot of the information we get through litigation is confidential until it's discussed in court. So timing couldn't be better. So I can share some of the things we learned here. We don't know when we'll get the decision or the judgment. The judgment's been reserved, but we're guessing within the next few months. Today I'll be talking about this legal challenge and the information we learned. To manage expectations, what the challenge was not about, it was not about the strengths or weaknesses of any particular policy or sectoral chapter in the net zero strategy. In fact, I'm looking forward to hearing on that from the other speakers today. Instead, our point was we can't properly judge those strengths in combination with the strengths of the other policies in the strategy to come to an overall view on whether there is an implementation gap, as the strategy doesn't give us or Parliament the necessary information. That's essentially what the case is about and this talk today. Before moving to the case, I'd like to remind us why closing the implementation gap is so important. In April, the IPCC released its report on global progress and pledges for mitigating climate change. The report was launched by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, I think it's pronounced in Portuguese. And he pulled no punches in his speech, which I'll read extracts from now. Quote, "The jury has reached a verdict, and it's damning. This report is a litany of broken climate promises. It's a file of shame, cataloguing the empty pledges that put us firmly on track towards an unlivable world. We are on a fast track to climate disaster. This is not fiction or exaggeration. It's what the science tells us will result from our current energy policies. We are on a pathway to global warming of more than double the 1.5 degree limit agreed in Paris. Some government and business leaders are saying one thing and doing another. Simply put, they are lying, and the results will be catastrophic. High-emitting governments and corporations are not just turning a blind eye, they're adding fuel to the flames. They are choking the planet based on their vested interests and historic investments in fossil fuels." So I'm getting a bit of feedback on the, cheers. To continue with the quote, when cheaper renewable solutions provide green jobs, energy solutions and greater price stability. We left COP26 with a naive optimism based on new promises and commitments. But the main problem, the enormous growing emissions gap, was all but ignored. The science is clear. To keep the 1.5 limit within reach, we need to cut global emissions by 45% this decade. But current climate pledges would mean a 14% increase in emissions. And most major emitters are not taking the steps needed to fulfill even those inadequate promises. Choices made by countries now will make or break the commitment to 1.5 degrees. A shift to renewables will mend our broken global energy mix and offer hope to millions of people suffering climate impacts today. Climate promises and plans must be turned into reality and action now. End quote. So that was the UN Secretary General launching the latest report from the world scientists on where we currently are. We heard in that talk about the emissions gap. That is how far short the world's NDC pledges are from what's needed to meet the Paris goals. For those who don't know, NDCs, nationally determined contributions, are what each country puts forward to the UN for their fair share of reductions needed to meet the Paris temperature goals. The speech also talked about the implementation gap, and that's how far short current action is from meeting even those inadequate pledges. The report that was being launched confirms that an emissions gap persists, and that is exacerbated by an implementation gap. And that's the world scientists telling us that. I should mention as an aside, there's a third gap that needs to be closed urgently, and that's the production gap, and that's the difference between the level of fossil fuel production currently planned and the much lower level we should be planning for if we're to meet the Paris goals and avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. And for more on all of these, see the IPCC reports and the reports of the UN Environment Programme. So that's at the global level. At the UK level, and for the implementation gap, to understand our legal challenge, we need to understand the legal framework which resulted in the net zero strategy, published shortly before COP26 last year. That framework is set out in the Climate Change Act 2008, which was an act that was the result of a Friends of the Earth campaign, the Big Ask campaign in the noughties. Under the Act, the main obligation is the net zero target. By the year 2050, the UK's carbon account must be 100% lower than 1990 levels. In plainer terms, net zero means we must be removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere at least as much as we're putting them in by 2050. To reach that challenging but necessary target, the Act requires the setting of 5-yearly carbon budgets along the way. And the government must ensure those budgets are met. Each successive budget is lower than the previous one on a trajectory to net zero by 2050. The budgets must be set 11.5 years in advance, and this means that last year, the government set the budget for the period 2033 to 2037, and this was the 6th carbon budget. Before doing so, it took advice from its experts, the Climate Change Committee, which recommended a budget of 965 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent for that 5-year period of domestic UK emissions. The committee, the experts, also set out a range of draft policies which it said could meet the budget, and it quantified the expected impact of those policies on emission reductions. The government didn't adopt all of those policies, but it did accept the level that the Climate Change Committee recommended. And in June last year, it set the 6th carbon budget into law. So some general observations on the setting of these budgets, which are relevant to our legal challenge. But budgets are carefully and publicly set. They show what the government thinks can be achieved. They already include analysis of what can be done within economic, social and fiscal restraints. They're numeric. They're quantified by reference to a specific time period, i.e. the budget periods. And to illustrate this, despite all of the hard work that went in, what comes out of the process is just a number. In fact, the legislation set in the 6th carbon budget has only one sentence as its operative provision. It literally reads, the carbon budget for the 2033 to 37 budgetary period is 965 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. It's a number the government must legally ensure is met. So that's the budget, that's the long-term pledges enshrined in law, how are they to be met, and how are we to avoid an implementation gap? The Climate Change Act deals with that by setting two key duties. First, the government must prepare such policies and proposals which it considers will enable the budgets to be met, and this is an ongoing duty. Second, as soon as practicable after setting a budget, the government must report to Parliament on the proposals and policies for meeting all of the current existing budgets. So the net zero strategy performed this task. It was the government's report to Parliament that was published, allowing for parliamentary scrutiny of the current proposals and policies that will enable us to meet the carbon budgets, including this new carbon budget for the 2030s. The previous such report was the Clean Growth Strategy in 2017, and there were ones before that. As Paul mentioned in the introduction, those previous reports didn't get us to net zero. They only dealt with the then current global carbon budgets. There's those two duties under the Act, to prepare policies and to report to Parliament, which are at the centre of our court case. Along with the net zero target and the carbon budgets, these duties are core features of the Act. So turning to our legal challenge, the net zero strategy was published and laid before Parliament last October. It purported to set the government's policies for meeting the carbon budgets, but Friends of the Earth were concerned about a lack of detail. We couldn't assess the ability of the policies to achieve the numeric targets because of the lack of quantified estimates of greenhouse gas impacts and their timescales. This was made worse as the strategy was particularly vague in certain important sectors. For example, in agriculture, there were long-term targets on how low-carbon farming practices, but not saying how we get there. And in home heating, where there are nods towards consultations, but no timescales. We were concerned that the claims made in the strategy that the policies would meet the budgets were not based on predictions. Instead, they appeared to be based on what was called in the strategy an indicative emissions pathway, or in the plural, indicative emissions pathways for the various sectors. That seemed to describe what decarbonisation was possible up to 2037, theoretically, in the key sectors, not what the actual policies and proposals were expected to deliver, which appeared to us to be a sleight of hand. We also had the Climate Change Committee's initial assessment, which wasn't all bad, but noted that the policies were not quantified, and nor were there any timescales contrary to its previous recommendation. And we know from writing to the committee ourselves that the government hasn't provided this quantification since publishing the strategy. This was worrying to us, as to reach a conclusion that your policies will enable quantified budgets to be met, you also need to quantify the effect of your policies, even if that is necessarily a predictive exercise with inbuilt uncertainties. You still need to do that exercise. We therefore engaged in legal correspondence. That wasn't fruitful, so we issued a claim for judicial review. As the claim has now been heard, we're allowed to talk publicly about the further evidence the government disclosed and about how it formulated the strategy. A key document was an October 2021 submission from civil servants to the decision-making minister, who in this case was Greg Hands, one of the ministers within the Business Secretary's department, which happens all the time and is completely fine. So the submission to Minister Hands, the purpose was to get his approval to publish the draft net zero strategy and to lay it before Parliament. We saw that written submission as part of the litigation, and it refers to the modelled pathways I talked about earlier, saying they show the, quote, potential of each sector to decarbonise. The submission says these pathways are supported by specific policies, and that whilst the strategy provides a strong foundation for decarbonisation in the 2030s, the policies and proposals are only predicted to deliver 95% of the reductions required for the sixth carbon budget. We also learned through the submission that there was apparently an ambitious spending review request, i.e. BEIS going to the Treasury for money, for the net zero policies in the strategy, but, quote, this did not result in all the funding requested. The submission went on to say, and I quote, the strategy, net zero strategy package credibly enables the UK to be on track to meet the carbon budgets. This is based on current modelling and planned policy work to identify further options over the coming years to deliver Carbon Budget 6 in full, taking advantage of technological progress, innovation and societal trends, end quote. So pausing there, there's a 5% shortfall in the quantification, and there was a plan to make up that 5%. The submission went on to say, quote, it's not necessary for the policies and proposals included on the face of the strategy to deliver 100% of the emission reductions required for Carbon Budget 6, providing they are sufficient to keep the targets in reach, and that we continue to develop further policies and proposals as required in the coming year, end quote. Coming years, I think I should say, sorry. Now that to me sounds like an implementation gap in the making that's creeping into the Climate Change Act regime. This is wrong in principle if government is allowed to decide the level of quantification, but also 5% is not insignificant. It amounts to around 50 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent that will need to be saved during the period 2033 to 37 in an already very challenging period of decarbonisation. We say that was unlawful, and the Act requires that 100% quantification was for the task. You have a numeric target, you need a numeric solution. Even if we're wrong, and it was okay to have 95% quantified, we say Parliament should have been told this, shouldn't have been given these indicative pathways that showed theoretical potential. It cannot be right that Parliament, the public, and others only learn these things through litigation. I'd pause to note the government has also refused FOI requests on its stats made by the New Scientist. So it's not just us that it was refusing to disclose. So what was the government's case in court? They said they can rely on unquantified policies and proposals to make up the 5%. They say whether to quantify at all, and how much, are matters of discretion for them, which the court should not interfere with unless their decisions are irrational. They say the Climate Change Act does not require any particular analysis or quantification. And our point in response is that the government cannot conclude its policies will enable the budgets to be met without numbers, and Parliament cannot scrutinise without numbers. And they say it's up to them what to include in their reports to Parliament, and that the strategy contained legally sufficient information. So what next? The High Court reserved its judgment. We hope to get a decision within the next few months. We hope the court agrees with our interpretation of the Act. If not, there are routes of further appeal. If we ultimately lose, we end up with a watered-down Act, we say. So it's an important case. If we win, we've asked the court to declare the strategy as unlawful and to make an order for the government to remedy the breaches. What we haven't asked for, which sometimes happens, is for the court to strike down the strategy. It's an important piece of strategy, and it's not all bad. We don't want to start from square one again, but we want the government to meet its legal obligations and to strengthen the Act. importantly, it's not just this strategy. These legal principles will apply next time round. So when the 7th carbon budget is set in a few years, there'll be another equivalent to net zero strategy. And the government then, who's going to be even more difficult position in terms of emission reduction, potentially other politics, they're not potentially going to want to be held accountable for these difficult decisions. So it's important that they are, by MPs, by us, by everybody. The government's approach leaves a permanent risk that it's too late to do anything about it, and a risk of an ever-widening implementation gap. As the Secretary-General said, climate promises must be turned into reality and action now. Thank you for listening. That's my talk, Chair.
Thank you very much, Niall. It was great. It was really interesting. So we have the Glissa platform for questions. So I'm not going to take questions from the floor. But please get typing away. We have one question on there at the moment, which isn't focused quite on the net zero strategy. It's a slightly broader question. So I'm thinking to take that in a few minutes. So perhaps I can ask you a quick question of clarification or two and take Chair's privilege.
Yeah.
So the first thing I wondered is, you said the government had quantified about 95% of the gap. Why did they just quantify 95%? I mean, if you get that close, why not just think about a small number of extra policies that get you all of the way?
We don't know. Possibly this spending review that wasn't fully met. Possibly they didn't get enough funding for the policies. We don't know. The implication, I think, from that ministerial submission is that civil service servants wanted a more ambitious package, but Treasury said no. That may be the reason.
And I'd be, one final one from me. I'd be very interested, I mean, you talked about them not having a firm plan, that they had ideas, essentially, about how they would meet it as opposed to a firm plan to meet it. I suppose if I were a minister, I'd say, well, it's a long way ahead and there's a lot of uncertainties, and therefore, if we make a firm plan now, it's almost certainly not going to be the best possible plan, and so we need to have some flexibility. So can you say what you would have looked for in terms of how to have a plan, but also have the flexibility for what we learn on the way?
The system is flexible. The duty to have the plans and policies is an ongoing duty. The policies and proposals, I mean, those two words give you the hint, but they're at different stages in development, and they'll always be, over time, they'll always be being developed. So what's set out in the strategy now might not look like what the policies are in 2037. Our point was, the Act requires the government to be satisfied that the policies will enable. Accepting there is judgment, prediction, uncertainties, it still needs to make that judgment. And this happens, I mean, it happens in the IPCC reports about looking into the future and making predictions based on quantifications. So that was a minimum it needed to do. For the government to say now, well, we've got these packages and they're not quite there, but we'll come up with more, that's not what the Act requires.
And I'd like to go to a question now on here, which is, what impact does uncertainty have on compliance with the Act?
What impact does...
Uncertainty. It's
related. Nobody in our case argued the government must be certain the policies will deliver certain. We accept this is looking into the future. It's built in. So I'm not sure, maybe there's more to that question I'm not twigging, but it's part of the process. The point is, factoring in those uncertainties, the government still needs to be satisfied that it will meet the carbon budgets.
Okay. What's your view on the implications of the new North Sea drilling licenses?
We had a bit off topic, I think, but off the cuff, but we had the report from the International Energy Agency, which historically has represented the fossil fuel industry, so it's quite conservative. It's not like us, for example, but last year it reported on the production that was necessary to meet the Paris goals, and it said we don't need any more production. That's the answer. If we want to meet the Paris goals, we don't need any more production. We don't need any new production. And in fact, we need to be cutting the existing production that's already consented. That was a different report. We, as you'd expect, opposed the licenses.
A lot of people are really interested. Do you think your case highlights a potential loophole or weakness in the Climate Change Act? If so, how do we close it?
Well, we hope not. I mean, we think this is the logical way to interpret the Act, and we've asked the court to make that ruling so it's clear. Otherwise, the way to amend a court decision we don't like is to lobby MPs to change the law, which they can do.
Okay. And quite a few people would like to know how likely you think it is that you're going to win the case. And is it normal for the court to reserve judgment?
Well, it's definitely normal for these type of cases for a reserve judgment. Yeah, we don't normally hear straight away. That's completely normal. We had a very experienced judge, Mr. Justice Holgate. He was very receptive to the arguments of us and the government. It was difficult from where I was sitting to say which way I would go. I think that's as far as I can say. I wish I knew what he was thinking.
Okay. And some people have come back to the policies in the net zero strategy, which do add up to 95% of the budget. Did they provide what you thought was convincing evidence for those policies to actually back up those numbers?
Very good question. It wasn't part of our case. You're limited, these type of cases, you're limited in what you can argue. There's a separation of powers, government has a discretion to do. So we weren't arguing for that batch of 95% that they did a bad job. Whether they did a bad job, we don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if they did. But we kind of said, for the purposes of our case, Judge, we're not saying this 95% is faulty, but we're saying the fact that it only got to 95% was the problem. I would be interested, like I said earlier, to hear from other speakers what they make of the policies, whether they appear that they feel that they are something that will deliver the budgets.
And we have a couple of questions about the Climate Change Committee.
Oh yeah.
So one quite specific one on noting that they've detailed future energy scenarios with nuclear power and your views on that, and then a wider one about whether the current remit and activities of the committee are sufficient to provide the necessary oversight on compliance with the Climate Change Act.
I'm probably going to pass on the nuclear power one because I'm not sure I've got a sort of settled view on that. I know Friends of the Earth are sort of thinking about the policies, so forgive me on that one. Is their remit sufficient for oversight and compliance? I think they do a good job. For example, the sixth carbon budget, they issued their recommendation and policies. They weren't legally required, but they did an initial response to the net zero strategy. Generally speaking, they don't pull their punches. And it's helpful to have that independent voice, expert voice, public, to inform government and parliament. I guess you could say there are certain things that they lack. They don't have enforcement powers. But they do have that regulatory and oversight function, which I think is generally working.
Thank you. I want to finish with two quite broader questions about other countries. So one is, to what extent are you working with groups in other countries who are also litigating at a national level? And the second one, more broadly, is how important do you think this type of activism is in order to achieve climate change goals?
We do work with other groups, both Friends of the Earth, but also other campaigners, activists around the world. In terms of legal challenges, the UK is a sort of discrete jurisdiction, even more so after Brexit. But a lot of the principles and arguments do read across. To an extent, the UK is a little bit ahead because it was the first country to have a framework law, which is what the Climate Change Act is. And this, I guess, is this case, I guess, is that framework law evolving. So I think we would support other countries. You mentioned I'm part of the Sabine Centre. I think it's pronounced like Sabine Centre. I haven't checked. Columbia Law School. That's a network of academics and lawyers who specialise in climate change law, and there is an increasing conversation between people bringing these challenges. For the reason I've just given, there is a lot of overlap. The second question, how important are these challenges? I'd say very important. I think governments are always going to be pulled in different directions, and they need to be held to account by people. And I think Friends of the Earth is a grassroots organisation. We are kind of in court to hopefully represent the views of our supporters. And that is an important tool in reaching the goals, as is general campaigning and making a noise and showing MPs that this should be a doorstep issue that they're going to get elected on. So the campaigning and litigation hopefully sit together as important tools, and all of the other important work.
Okay, that's great. Many thanks, Niall, for coming and talking to us today. It's been really, really interesting. Okay, so just before we go to the next session, can I just ask speakers for all sessions, please, before your session starts, to go to the room a few minutes early to get a microphone so we can get you wired up. And with that, I'd like to pass over to Michael Bradshaw, who is chairing the first plenary session.
So, Stefan, you need to get the mic from Niall. We haven't got enough microphones to go around. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on the global energy crisis, implications for the UK's energy security and net zero ambitions. My name is Mike Bradshaw. I'm Professor of Global Energy at Warwick Business School and a co-director of UKIRC, where I lead a theme on UK energy in a global context, which has turned out to be quite an important theme, much more so than when we started the programme, perhaps. I think it's already mentioned by Paul, but the focus of Phase 4 of UKIRC is on new challenges and opportunities for implementing the energy transition. Well, I think few of us thought that those new challenges would include a pandemic, potentially perhaps a global price crisis, but of course now the global implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is still ongoing. So there's a heightened level of uncertainty around those challenges and their consequences. So what I want to do is just to set the scene. I don't have a formal presentation as such, but given I often run over time, I've written it down, so I stick to my script. Okay, so we're in a world now of $120 a barrel plus, £2 at the pump. We talk of an energy price crisis, a cost of living crisis. It's worth remembering that at the beginning of the pandemic, in spring of 2020, oil and gas prices crashed. In the US, they went negative for a period of time. And I can recall, actually, the price of unleaded at the pump in Birmingham was 99 pence. The price crash was in part, of course, caused by a disagreement between Saudi Arabia and Russia over the need to cut oil production, and an agreement was allegedly brokered by Donald Trump. So how times have changed. That was little more than 2 years ago. And since then, the global energy markets have been on a roller coaster. Now, I think it's well understood that oil and gas prices and markets are both cyclical and volatile. But the current situation has seen gas prices in Europe hit unprecedented levels. I think all of us are seeing the consequences of that in what we're having to pay for gas and electricity in our homes, with the threat of even further increases this coming autumn as Ofgem reviews the price cap. There's nothing new about oil price volatility, but the current uncertainty is driven by the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Europe's determination to pivot away from its current reliance on Russia's fossil fuel imports. Don't forget, Russia is the world's largest exporter of hydrocarbons. So this is not something that can happen overnight, but it's causing dislocations in global markets as commodity flows seek to adjust. If this were not enough, as we heard from Niall, last November many of us were in Glasgow for COP26, the theme of which was seeking to close the gap between action and ambition in relation to implementing policies needed to mitigate and adapt to climate change. For the first time at a COP, the official declaration included the determination to phase down fossil fuel consumption. Ahead of the meetings for the first of 3 reports from the IPCC's Assessment Round 6 on the physical science was described as Code Red for Humanity. and I'm going to quote Antonio Gutierrez as well, at the launch of the third report on mitigation. He said, if we don't see significant and sustained emissions reductions this decade, the window of opportunity to keep 1.5 alive will be closed, and closed forever. And that will be a disaster for everyone. That same report suggested emissions needed to peak by 2025 and fall by 45% by the end of the decade to stay on a 1.5 degrees pathway. In my own research, I've written about what I call the global energy dilemma. Put simply, can we have a secure and affordable access to energy services that are also environmentally benign? Because the environmental impact of energy is obviously climate change is the headline, but there are many more negative environmental consequences associated with energy production of all kinds. Now, others would separate security and affordability to create a trilemma, but I'm not sure how you can do that. How secure is energy that cannot be afforded? It's probably fair to say that until recently, it was the need to accelerate the deployment of low-carbon energy sources that was driving energy policy. And we've heard the discussions this morning already about our own government's energy strategy. And certainly that is the motivation for our research in UKirk, how to accelerate decarbonisation to achieve our carbon budgets and create a net zero economy by 2050. But I think it's also fair to say that at the moment, the concerns about energy security, which have been relatively muted in the past, don't forget we've been talking about a world of relative fossil fuel abundance and unburnable carbon. Energy security has moved up the agenda, both in terms of physical security of supply and affordability. But the climate change challenge remains, and we need to accelerate the energy transition. And at the same time, of course, the physical impact of climate change is increasingly apparent. So there are now concerns that actions taken to address energy security may slow the rate of progress, which is already woefully inadequate. The progress that is being made to decarbonize the global energy system. So I think it's very useful to start our discussions by thinking about this current context that we find ourselves in, both in terms of energy security, physical security and affordability, and what its consequences might be for accelerating progress on decarbonisation. So we have got 3 presentations this morning that speak to the causes and consequences of the current crisis, with a geographical focus on the UK and the EU. Because, of course, one of the other things we're having to grapple with in this context is Brexit and what that means for our energy relations with the European Union, who seem quite comfortable in quite literally wiping us off the map when they want to look at energy infrastructures in Europe. So we have, as I say, 3 presentations, and what I will do, I will provide a quick introduction. You can find the details of our speakers in the conference material. Each speaker is going to have 15 minutes. It will take a little bit. What I propose to do is to run through the 3 presentations, and then we'll have hopefully time for Q&A at the end, where we'll be standing between you and lunch, so stick to time. Okay, so the first presentation will be backed by Jack Sharples, who's a research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, with whom we are cooperating on with some of our work in UKIRK Theme 1. And he will be speaking about UK security of gas supply in a European context, physical and price aspects. And Jack and I have been playing a sort of duo in various parliamentary hearings of late around these issues. I won't say it was Laurel and Hardy, and I won't say who's who, but anyway. Our second speaker is Stefan Berakovsky, who is Professor of Geography at the University of Manchester, who will speak about the brave new world of state-led energy security governance in Europe, emerging tensions and contradictions. And our final speaker will be my colleague Caroline Kuzemko, Reader in International Political Economy in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick. And together with Anthony Froggatt at Chatham House, Caroline has been leading a Theme 1 project on Brexit and net zero policymaking, and she will be talking about Russia's war on the Ukraine. What does it mean for just and sustainable transitions? And hopefully by the end of that, we'll have set the context for a discussion about what the current concerns might mean for the progress of net zero energy transitions. So, Jack, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. And also thank you very much to UKIRK for the invitation to join you here today. Now, clearly, what I'm going to be presenting on right now does stand in a little bit of a contrast to much of what we are going to be discussing over the next 2 days, insofar as it focuses unashamedly on fossil fuel supply. But I think just picking up from Mike's introduction, it's very important that we get a clear understanding of where we are right now, and so everything that I will be presenting really focuses on UK supply at present and what we have to look forward to in the coming winter. So, to begin, just to help familiarise everybody with where the UK gets its gas supply from. So you can see the blue bars at the bottom, that's UK production. The red bars refer to pipeline imports from Norway. The green bars refer to our LNG imports. And then the balancing elements around the edge, you can see in the purple very small amounts of storage movements. The UK lacks large-scale seasonal storage facilities. Instead, what we have are a number of very small facilities that are constantly being sort of filled and then emptied many times through each season. So sort of, the endless porridge pot from the Brothers Grimm. And then finally, the yellow bars at the bottom, that refers to our pipeline interconnections with Belgium and the Netherlands that help balance the UK market. So as you can see, UK production very much focused on our own, UK supply, sorry, very much focused on our own production, pipeline imports from Norway and LNG. Now the problem that we face in the absence of our large-scale seasonal gas storage facilities is that UK demand is highly seasonal. So the red line here refers to domestic, that is household gas consumption for space heating mostly, and then to a lesser extent, obviously, for your hot water as well. But even we can see seasonal aspects to industrial energy consumption, the yellow line, and also what we refer to as other, anything that's not caught in heat and power, domestic or industry. The heat and power you will see is a bit less seasonal, mainly because it depends on let's say, supply from other sources. So you can see that there's been fluctuations in line with some of the build out of renewables, some of the phase out of coal and various other things. So it does move around a little bit. But in that context, we can have a look at UK summer gas supply. So you can see that the notable point here is that production is dominant. We ramp down our imports from Norway and in the form of liquefied natural gas, and we ramp up some of our net exports to Europe. Essentially, in the summertime, the UK is very well supplied, and so we export gas to Europe, where it is placed into seasonal storage facilities, of which the EU has plenty. So in the UK, our seasonal gas storage accounts for a couple of percent, let's say, of our equivalent annual demand, whereas in the EU, they have enough storage capacity equivalent to over a fifth, maybe even pushing towards 25% of annual demand. So the rest of the EU can balance its market on a much more seasonal basis. In the UK, we rely very much on a just-in-time model of gas supply throughout the winter, that we continue to ramp up our imports throughout the winter to reflect demand, and we get this picture. So that is UK gas supply during winter for the last several years, and you can see that the imports from Norway and the LNG imports ramp up, and also usually we import gas back from the European continent. So effectively we ship gas out to Europe in the summer, it's placed into storage, and then we buy it back during the winter. It's a rather simplistic way of putting it, but notably the past winter was an exception, that we continued exporting gas on a net basis to Europe. Now, part of the reason for that is that the European market tightened, and relative to that in the UK, let's say, and so there was a bit of a disconnect in prices, and it encouraged the export of gas from the UK out to Europe, which then had a slight impact of tightening the market here. Now, that's the situation for UK supply at present. The question is, how would the UK gas supply be challenged by a curtailment of Russian supply to Europe? Now let's break this down by the Norwegian supply and the LNG supply and the interconnectors. Now, please don't fear this graph if you're unfamiliar with this, but effectively Norway has pipeline connections to the EU to France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, and a pipeline connection to the UK. Now, this graph just refers to Norwegian pipeline exports to the EU, and the key point here is that they have been pretty much operating at full capacity throughout the winter past and continue to do so. So there is very little in the way of spare capacity for Norway to, let's say, realign some of its exports away from the UK towards continental Europe. In the event that Russian pipeline supply to the EU is curtailed, the prices spike there. Sorry, I'm getting quite a lot of feedback. Is there anything we can... No worries. Yes, so if Russian pipeline supply to the EU is curtailed, prices spike, they try to get hold of extra supply. There is not much in the way of spare capacity for Norwegian flows to be redirected. Now, a slight caveat is that a new pipeline is set to enter into operation in October, the Baltic pipe, but that's actually going to be a spur from the existing Euro pipe from Norway down to Germany, which will then run through Denmark and on to Poland. But because of the way that the pipeline infrastructure is structured, let's say, it would only have a limited impact on the UK. So as it stands, the UK pipeline supply from Norway is relatively secure. Now, if we turn to LNG imports, so this graph refers to LNG imports into northwestern Europe at several key terminals. So at Montoir and Dunkirk in France, Zeebrugge in Belgium, and Gate Rotterdam into the Netherlands. So essentially the other terminals in northwestern Europe that can on occasion compete with the UK for LNG cargoes. And again, the key point here is that for several months now, those LNG terminals have been operating at full capacity. So effectively, again, there is no spare capacity for cargoes to be diverted away from the UK into the northwestern part of the EU. So in fact, what we're seeing, again, is I refer back to these pipeline interconnectors, is that LNG is being brought into the UK, regasified, injected into the European system, and then exported back out to continental Europe, which is what we see here. So these are the monthly net imports and exports from the UK to continental Europe. So anything above the line is an import into the UK from Europe, and everything that's negative is an export from the UK to Europe. So normally what happens, as I mentioned, is that we send gas to Europe in the summer, bring it back in the winter. That didn't happen in the winter past, which you can just see on the far right of the graph there. It went very close to zero in the middle of winter, and then has gone strongly in favour of UK exports to Europe. And that is continuing. Those pipelines are now, those two pipelines, one to Belgium, one to the Netherlands, are operating at close to 90% of their combined capacity. So this is all creating a very specific situation, that the UK is relatively well supplied in terms of its own production, its pipeline imports from Norway, its LNG imports, and we are exporting gas at close to full capacity back to continental Europe. And as a result, the wholesale prices between the UK and northwestern Europe have decoupled. So the blue line is the wholesale price for the front month contract on the national balancing point here in the UK. The red line refers to the TTF, the Title Transfer Facility in the Netherlands, which is the most liquid trading hub in northwest Europe. So you can see this differential has emerged. That is encouraging these pipeline exports from the UK to continental Europe. My concern here is that this may be lulling some of us into a bit of a false sense of security, that the UK is in quite a cosy and privileged position relative to the rest of Europe in terms of its gas supply. Look at the discount, aren't we doing well? Part of the problem, of course, is if you look at that UK wholesale price on the far right, even at that very steep discount to the TTF in Europe, that price of 40 euros per megawatt hour, although it's down significantly from the early part of winter, that is still more than twice the average price that the UK experienced between the whole of 2017, 18 and 19, which was closer to around 18 euros per megawatt hour. So don't be fooled, gas is still very expensive in the UK, just at present slightly less expensive than in the rest of Europe. Now, this is where I start to bring everything together. Don't be lulled into a false sense of security. As I mentioned earlier, the UK is pretty well supplied during the summer months to the extent that we can export gas to the rest of Europe. During the winter, ordinarily, we import gas back. We effectively take gas out of European storage systems to compensate for the fact that the UK has no seasonal gas storage, instead relying on this just-in-time model of supply. So what I would expect is that even if Russian flows continue as they are doing, at the start of winter, that pricing gap between the UK and the rest of Europe will close. Either the rest of Europe will start to take gas out of its seasonal storage. That will act as an additional form of supply to the rest of Europe. The UK, even if it's not physically importing gas back from Europe, at least we will probably cease exporting gas to Europe, if you like. And we will be seeking to continue our LNG imports and keep our supply throughout the winter at a time when, as I mentioned, UK demand is highly seasonal. We use a lot of gas for space heating during the winter. So the market should tighten. UK prices will rise back towards the European level. Now, of course, the big question is what happens if Russian supply to Europe is curtailed during the coming winter? So this is the geopolitical aspect, if you like, plugging into some of Mike's work. Now, what we would expect, firstly, is that prices will spike in Europe. There will be immense competition for alternative supply in the form of LNG cargoes. So not just into Northwest Europe, where the terminals are already operating at full capacity, but in other parts of Europe as well, particularly in Italy, in Greece, other terminals around Europe. The situation's a little different in Spain. The Iberian Peninsula is somewhat cut off from the rest of the European market, mainly due to a relative lack of pipeline interconnections between France and Spain. So that regional market, if you like, wouldn't be so affected by a Russian cutoff in a physical supply sense. But as concerns the rest of Europe, yes, there would be more competition for these LNG cargoes. European prices would spike. If UK prices did not follow suit, then traders would be seeking to buy gas on the NBP in the UK and then ship it through the interconnectors into Europe. That would tighten the UK market. UK prices would probably rise also. So I guess the message I'm trying to get across here is, at present, we are pretty well supplied, but UK demand is highly seasonal, and if there is any interruption in Russian flows to Europe during the coming winter, European prices will spike and ours will do so as well. And we'll get back to this quite worrying high price environment that we saw over the past winter. So I think on that, and of course, again, we leave ourselves at the mercy, of course, of climatic factors, short-term, seasonal. It seems that for those of us who analyse the European gas market, it seems that our constant refrain is everything depends on the weather. The difference between a mild winter and a cold winter can have huge impact on European gas demand and, by extension, European gas prices. So in the event of a curtailment of Russian flows to Europe during the coming winter, we would be crossing our fingers and hoping very much that the winter was mild. So on that admittedly somewhat somber note, I would like to hand back to Mike. I don't know if we're taking questions first or doing
questions afterwards.
Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Jack. So if nothing else, you'll understand why gas prices are going up and down at the moment and why the winter is uncertain, to say the least. And one of the things that's very important in understanding what's going to happen next is what happens in Europe. And that's partly what Stefan's going to talk to. You're going to come here, hopefully. Now he's mic'd up.
Yeah. Right.
I'll hand the floor over to Stefan, and thanks for immaculate timing, Jack. Learn from that, Stefan. Immaculate timing.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Right, so thank you, Mike. Thank you to the conference organisers for inviting me to be here today, and welcome to Manchester as well. I mean, my talk isn't going to strike any more optimism than you already heard, I'm afraid. But I am going to move more onto the regulatory domain, and I will talk about what's happening at the level of the European Union, or what this whole situation is creating in terms of the changing policy landscape, and particularly the emergence of energy demand as an energy security strategy. And I should say that I am also representing UK's sister project, CREDS, here, precisely because of that focus on energy demand. Now, I think we know roughly the contours of what's being discussed. There was a gas price crunch in the autumn of 2021. Everything got worse with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But then there's also this very complex and Jake already sort of brought some of that up. This very complex infrastructural background. We've done that work in previous phases of UKIRK with overlapping geopolitical realities. And what's really interesting here is that there are these shared regulatory competencies of the EU. And people sometimes say that the power of the EU is that it's a regulatory powerhouse. And this is kind of interesting, this whole situation, in terms of what sort of new realities it's created as the EU tries to address these dual security but also energy demand and climate challenges. We have seen massive budget commitments, over 180 billion euros for consumers and businesses, even more for rebuilding storage facilities, cover extra costs and so on. And that's just now. I think money is going to increase. But I think all of this is creating two tensions, and I just wanted to talk about this a little bit today. It has also lots of implications for the UK. One is around the changing, and I would also say the expanding role of the state in the governance of energy security in Europe. And the other is really the repositioning of energy demand as an energy security strategy. I think that's really interesting, and again, that has also implications for the UK as well. Now, in terms of the regulatory instruments that we've seen for this landscape to happen, I mean, a lot of them are in the existing arsenal of regulatory instruments around energy, but there have been some new ones. Some of them have to do with how oil is regulated, around strategic reserves, minimum inventory level requirements, and of course subsidies for low-income households and energy to address energy poverty in particular. But then we've seen also these movements around automatic collective solidarity, potentially collective strategic reserves. So moving what the IEA recommends for oil stocks to then do that for gas. There's been discussion of a collective energy crisis fund, and also moving into gas futures in a more strategic way as well. And this is what I think this is doing also. It's shaking up the fundamentals of the EU's energy market, of the EU's single energy market, which the UK is somehow also affiliated to, if not in a direct regulatory sense, certainly in an infrastructural sense, which I think was brought up earlier. And the statements that are coming in from the EU Institute for Security Studies, for me, are very indicative. So after so many years of market fundamentalism, I would say, in the regulation of energy, we're now seeing statements like laissez-faire economics cannot and should not apply to energy markets. In this current situation, if you do scarcity pricing, this is called scarcity pricing now, we will have economic harm on both directly but also indirectly through the uncertainties and also the constraints that this creates. It's also been talked. This is now being described as a market failure, which compromises low carbon transitions and deepens social inequalities. And also people are saying we need to honestly re-examine the entire marginal pricing model. Now, that sort of movement is now gradually being fed into various policies at the European level. There was that toolbox that the European Commission published back in the autumn. It was heavily criticized, but it did start the debate in terms of what the short and long-term measures and medium-term measures really would be to shield consumers, and also to start opening this question up in relation also to low-carbon energy, which the Repower EU plan, which was published recently, put center stage. So that the Repower EU, I would say, is one of the very few times we have seen that explicit link being made between energy security and energy demand. And we've seen things like, across the EU, VAT rate reductions. That's not happening in the UK for a range of reasons. All kinds of targeted fiscal measures, adjustments to state aid rules, and also a huge expansion of direct support to vulnerable groups. Again, it's a long discussion. I won't go into the details, precisely in the interest of time. And also the whole issue around gas storage and joint voluntary procurement of gas stocks have also come in. Now, all of this has also created all kinds of tensions. partly because of the subsidiarity rules that the EU operates under, but also because all of a sudden certain regulations are being tweaked to allow for these changes and these pressures to come in. The taxonomy rules have been one of the big challenges, because all of a sudden things like nuclear and gas, which weren't there, have come back in. But also there's the delay in applying the trading scheme, the emissions trading scheme to transport and construction is also on the cards. And this is where some of the really big tensions start to emerge, with a group of countries, particularly in the Mediterranean, starting to do their own thing and proposing their own thing I mean, I'm not going to go into the details, but a lot of it is around, for example, electricity price stabilizers, decoupling electricity prices from marginal and inframarginal rates, hedging against gas price spikes. And these are just examples, and there are so many if you go across the EU. I mean, I was in Bulgaria just 2 weeks ago, and Bulgaria is just delaying the whole of the opening up of the electricity market, or the liberalization of electricity market to consumers. I think what's really interesting here in this securitization debate, I don't have time to go into this, is the sort of the energy efficiency first principle and the figure of the negawatt. How am I doing for time?
Got a bit more time.
Okay, I was not going to talk a lot about this, but for me it's a fascinating figure, because the negawatt, energy saved, is becoming a sort of asset. It's becoming an energy security asset that is being embedded in so many policies across these different scales. And what's interesting about the negawatt is it's an immaterial resource, but yet enrolls all kinds of infrastructures. It is flexible, and the question of flexibility becomes central. It can, and it has remained outside the market system, so there is now essentially an effort to co-opt the negawatt into that market system. But as people have said, it's individuated and abstracted. So basically, it has to be standardized in a sense that allows for that element of security, an element of energy saving to come in. And the negawatt is not just now in this emergence of energy security as a strategy connected to demand reduction. It is not just a security tool, it is a low carbon tool. And that is, I think, where things are moving and where a lot of these policies are heading, and potentially creating all kinds of interesting questions around what the EU can do and whether the EU can set an example with its regulatory powers for other regions in the world. And in terms of what's happening on the demand side, particularly around these measures, we are seeing, again, a whole range of efficiency support expansion, particularly for vulnerable groups. A lot of, again, interesting measures around the reduction of support for things that are seen as going against energy security and climate security, so combination of those measures. Particularly the banning of new gas boilers is an interesting one happening in a number. Vienna did it, the Netherlands have done it. I think I saw something about France the other day where it hasn't been as feasible. Countries have basically moved subsidies away from new gas boilers, but it's still quite timid. There is, however, a direction of travel, which I think is interesting. The Iberian exception, again, due to the whole positionality of the Iberian market, is an interesting example, again, around the capping of the wholesale natural gas price, and basically an exception for the whole price setting system of electricity. And I think we're going to see more and more of these state-led interventions, exceptions into the EU system, but undermining that whole structure of the market, but also then creating opportunities in some ways, sometimes for low carbon transitions, in other sending signals in the other direction. So I was really hoping for a bit more discussion. So I opened up, I think there are what I think are 5 questions that are important here. So for me, observing this situation, the market seems to be both the source of and solution to these gas security challenges. Simply, there are, in mainstream discourses, there is an acknowledgement that the market has gone so far that intervention is happening at the edges of the market. But in many ways, those edges are being constantly eaten away, and they're being eaten away in unpredictable way. So I guess the question is, to what extent in the period to come we're going to see an overhaul of even some of the more fundamental pillars of the single energy market. The question of subsidiarity is absolutely central as well, because there are lots of tensions around where the competencies of different authorities end and which kinds of policies can be implemented where. One of the challenges with all of this, there's a discussion later today around how far, for example, the European Social Fund, which is supposed to be a measure for basically shielding those who are vulnerable from all of this, how far it can go in light of subsidiarity principles. And a lot of these other incursions into the market are happening in places where those regulatory competencies are weaker. The geographical difference, and maybe Caroline will speak more to that, for me is also fascinating, because there is an east-west split in how far these measures are seen to be needing to go. Yet there's also been an east-west split in terms of the climate challenge previously, because a lot of those Eastern European countries have been the ones saying, no, we don't want more aggressive climate measures. So I feel that the securitization of energy demand is precisely midway between those challenges. And another one really is the sequencing and timing of what's happening. And I'm looking at what a lot of countries are doing, looking at Czech Republic, for instance, and you look at their measures and they're saying, we're going to put new LNG here, we're going to build these alternative measures, et cetera, but that again brings gas even more into, it's an infrastructural solution to gas, not a market one, but very state-led, and then nevertheless. It's quite interesting what sort of lock-ins this creates and when and how that crisis mode that all of this operates in. A crisis mode which, by the way, also allows for some of these other policy elements to come in when that crisis mode will stop in order to allow for more low-carbon measures to come in. There is a general feeling that everything that's happening with the Russian invasion is, in fact, speeding up the low-carbon transition, even though it doesn't seem to be the case. Again, I don't want to encroach into your territory there, Caroline, but I hope this has been of interest, and I don't know how much I kept my time, but thank you. Cheers.
Can I just encourage everyone to put the questions into the chat so that I can pick them up here, and then at the end we'll have everyone sitting at the front and we can deal with the questions. So many thanks to Stefan, and then Caroline, you have the floor in the final presentation.
I'm not promising to stay on time, but I will try really, 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 really hard. Okay, so just straight into the presentation. I'm trying to figure out, with my broader interest in the politics of sustainable energy transitions, the politics of keeping climate change on political agendas so we may continue to act. That's my sort of overall broad take on what I'm going to be talking about today. What I'm talking about relates kind of to a paper that I've been writing with Mathieu Blondil and Marie-Claire Brisebois, Claire Dupont, where we focus more on Europe, but for the purposes of today, I've focused more on the UK and what the UK has been doing, relatively speaking. Okay, so the starting point, the background for the paper, is obviously observing that there's a lot of policy change going on at the moment in response to a particular perceived foreign policy decision to reduce imports of Russian oil and gas. The timescales differ, obviously, between the UK, where this is actually relatively slightly easier to do, and the rest of Europe. But in order to do so, you have to change policy quite a lot. So this is a big movement, and we ought to know what's going on. But it's also a very specific way of framing energy, isn't it? Thinking about energy security in this geopolitical sense, which tends to make us think more about us, what our country or what our region's needs are in terms of the EU. But it relatively makes us think less about other parts of the world and what possible knock-on effects might be. And I come back to that at the end. Now, I'm also a starting point for thinking about this is, apologies, because Michael wants to think about it as a duolemma? No. I'm thinking about energy policy as a trilemma. So I'm thinking about it in terms of security, in terms of affordability, and in terms, obviously, of climate change mitigation. And what's happened at points of energy or perceived energy crises in the past is that sustainability can, relatively speaking, slip a little bit down energy policy agendas. So if this has happened in the past, what's happening this time around in terms of the new energy security crisis? But it's not quite as simple as that, because in previous crises, if you look at the 70s and responses, energy efficiency, in fact, was a big winner from that. And then if you look at the Russia-Ukraine gas transit disputes in the noughties, the repositioning of renewables as homegrown for many parts of the world, UK included, was also a beneficial move to some extent politically. But I'm also interested in just transitions. And I'm just going to say that we can think about these in domestic terms. So you can think about it in terms of the UK. You could think about it within the EU as within member states under the EU umbrella. But you can also think about just transitions in a global sense. So it's quite a broad concept, and I'll touch on those different aspects of it. And it's not just obviously to do with affordability, it's to do with the many costs, but also the many benefits associated with sustainable energy transitions and how they are distributed. Now, of course, it's not just ideologically important to think in terms of just transitions. For some people, it might not be ideologically important. It can be morally important if you look at the work of people like Simon Caney. But for me, as someone who's interested in the politics of climate change, just transitions are pretty crucial to keeping climate change on agendas, to avoiding the kinds of backlashes that you can see from those in society who lose out from transitions, workers in fossil fuel industries, et cetera, But you also want to quite proactively enthuse society about sustainable energy transitions. You want it to be a positive thing, and therefore these questions of justice and costs and benefits are really important to that. And this feeds into the work of people like Cameron Roberts and Pete Newell, who are thinking about how you balance rapid but also just transitions, and how you actively design policies, climate policies, that have positive feedback loops, so that they're good then for other policy areas, good across the trilemma, like energy efficiency. Okay, so look really briefly, because I'm sure you've all seen the UK policy responses. They're made up mainly of the British Energy Security Strategy, the Energy Bill Support Scheme and Levy, and one I would say obviously very much focused on security, one focused on affordability in a domestic sense, and then also the sort of the increased momentum. Stefan's already referred to this in the EU, where it's further along, but there's increased momentum in the UK to include gas and nuclear now in what is considered green for investment purposes. So these are the kinds of things that are happening under the umbrella, particularly for the British Energy Security Strategy, of the notion of homegrown. So the Prime Minister's introduction to the strategy is all about energy independence, not relying on unreliable other countries, and the solution needing to be homegrown. So most of what you see in the energy security strategy could fit under that umbrella, leaving to the side, of course, that we need critical minerals for renewables, and leaving to the side that we need uranium for nuclear. But anyway. So what does this mean in terms of sustainability? Like, it means lots of things, but I'm just going to touch on some things here, and hopefully we can discuss more in terms of the debate. Now, I'm quite interested within the context of the trilemma about what is now considered to be secure and what is considered to be sustainable and how that changes over time. And there are some sort of subtle and not so subtle shifts going on here. At one point, sort of at the start of this process, there were sort of blogs and responses coming out saying, well, maybe this is going to mean that fossil fuels, just per se, full stop, are now seen as less reliable than they used to be because of this geopolitical focus. But that really seems to have just turned into, it's only really Russian fossil fuels that are now seen as unsecure. So it's sort of narrowed down to that. But the other interesting sort of highlight, I think, in terms of how we think about what's secure and sustainable is that renewables sort of standing up a little bit more in a geopolitical sense as being more secure. So that means I don't know if you've seen sort of the big Greenpeace thing, like renewables as peace, and then there's sort of IRENA reports about how renewables are more reliable because they're homegrown, so then you're not having to think about global supply chains and wars and conflicts and all the rest of it. So this emphasis on geopolitical aspects of security make you think differently about renewables in terms of security than maybe some of the previous domestic debates emphasizing renewables as variable and therefore less secure. So I think that's sort of quite interesting. And then sort of, collectively, if you look at what the UK has done, maybe slightly less so, but also with the Repower EU strategy in the EU, there's greater shift in support, I think, for electrification and for heat pumps, which is an interesting turn. In terms of nuclear, obviously in the UK, that's a really big part of the new announcements in terms of what's going to happen. And obviously in the UK, this is being viewed as sustainable because it's a clean, low-carbon energy source. But there are all sorts of questions, of course, in relation to sustainability as to how doable that's going to be, how much that can contribute near term to between now and 2030, which is so important in terms of emission reductions, but even how we would help to reduce imports in the short term, because isn't this like what we're trying to do under the umbrella of the BESS strategy? And then, of course, there are clear environmental sustainability questions about nuclear, about its waste, about where its waste goes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the other thing that's happened in the UK, of course, is the increased momentum behind new drilling licenses in the North Sea. And that does not tie in, as again discussed earlier, with the notion of the need for no new oil and gas in order to meet 1.5 degrees. The build-out of new LNG gas infrastructures, LNG in particular within the EU, in order to be able to reduce their 45% reliance on Russian gas, is a really big question in terms of, is it lock-in, or will it become stranded asset? And then, obviously, there are implications of including gas in the green taxonomy. It paves the way for GSD-type funds to then claim that they are investing in a green way, or for anyone else for that matter. So, affordability. This slide is thinking about affordability mainly in a more domestic kind of sense. And I am going to touch on Repower EU, because actually I wanted to start each slide with something reasonably positive. And the real sort of positive thing going on in terms of affordability is much more in the Repower EU, which is significant in terms of the commitment that it's making to bringing forward aspects of the Social Climate Fund, therefore bringing forward investment for buildings retrofits beneath that, but also the really considerable measures put in place to protect vulnerable users, albeit much of that is couched in terms of temporary because of the state's markets kind of tensions. In the UK, like the elephant that didn't even get into the room in the British energy security strategy is energy efficiency, but then obviously the wider demand side response, flexibility, reducing peak, all of those kinds of good things. And if a crisis is a moment where you can implement change, then this is a real missed opportunity. And it's particularly a missed opportunity when you think of UK consumers and the degree to which they are vulnerable to rising gas prices, and they are more vulnerable than other parts of Europe because of the quality of housing stock and the sharp drop-off in buildings retrofits since 2013. So that's not so great on the affordability front. And, you know, if you want to talk in terms of win-wins, well, energy efficiency and demand-side response policies are good across the trilemma, and they're good in relation to other aspects of policy in the UK. So just a couple more things on affordability. The geopolitical decision to reduce and phase out completely Russian imports does place upward pressure on gas prices and therefore also electricity prices. So that doesn't help in affordability terms. And then, of course, there are all sorts of questions about nuclear, whether or not that is indeed, if you put everything together in terms of buildings, delays, costs, overruns, and decommissioning at the other end of it, which we are increasingly learning more about how much it's going to cost, you know, question mark, is that affordable for UK citizens? Okay, last slide. Broader themes. So I said I'd come back out to this notion of globally just transitions. And the way in which the focus at the moment in the UK and the EU is on our security. And when you're thinking about our security within this geopolitical environment where you're feeling less secure, of course you are, it does mean that you don't tend to see others, or maybe even think about what the knock-on effects might be for other parts of the world. And let's face it, 1.5 degrees is for the world. We are all in this together, so it really matters. So like maybe thinking forward to the next COP27, not so far away, sort of the notion that you can allow new drilling licenses in the North Sea makes you look somewhat hypocritical as a historical emitter. And obviously within the context also of all sorts of debates about equitable redistribution of unburnable carbon. Question marks about whether this quite rapid scale up in renewables, so both within the UK, there's been sort of a little bit more support for solar, quite a lot more support for offshore. Within the EU, a lot more support for renewables. What does that do? If we're all trying to do it at the same time, what kinds of pressures is that going to put on critical mineral supply chains? Does that then end up being a new geopolitics, but this time of different kinds of resources? And then, of course, the UK may be slightly less so, but together with the EU, we are placing ourselves in direct competition with the East Asian markets for LNG, which means it has upward pressure on global gas prices. It means that there has been a switch to coal in some parts of the world. And then as there's a switch to coal, there's been upward pressure on coal prices. So it just makes electricity more expensive all over the world as a knock-on effect. And then I'm going to also touch, as we do in our paper, on these arguments about more direct state engagement, but I'm not going to say too much because Stefan's already touched on it. But just, I might just pick up in particular, if you're really going to go for nuclear, it's difficult. And that's why sometimes maybe we're seeing these statements from the Prime Minister recently about needing to take a 20% stake in Sizewell C in order to get it off the ground, with EDF coming in for another 20%. And it just seems to be a direction of travel at the moment. And you know, the UK was the leader in terms of market liberalisation. The EU very much took up on that. But with COVID-19 and now with the cost of living crisis, the notion that the state should step in order to address those crises seems now quite consistent over these periods of time. And if I think back to 2008 in the UK and the response to the financial crisis, that was austerity. So that was something very, very different from what we're seeing now. So that sort of makes me think about this direction of travel. And then just lastly, there's the need, this geopolitical foreign policy need to get off Russian oil and gas is causing some really short-term thinking. And that short-term thinking and then the knock-on effects elsewhere in terms of coal use makes me worry even more about the 45% or the 7.6% per annum GHG reduction that's needed between now and 2030. And it seems to me as a distraction. I mean, surely now we should be putting in strategies to phase out oil and gas and coal in the UK and the rest of the world. It distracts capital that could be going into heat pumps or renewables or energy efficiency or whatever it is. And just lastly, the UK and the EU, of course, are doing all sorts of things in terms of relieving short-term pressures on consumers, but they're not doing enough either in the EU, although they talk a lot about that central pillar of energy efficiency. The policies behind it are somewhat limited and very limited in the UK. So that's really short-term in terms of thinking how you protect consumers and how you address affordability. Because the long-term way of doing that is just having lower household energy bills because you're well insulated. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, if we could sit on the stools, as it were, to build the questions. They don't look very stable.
We get a drink.
Well, okay. Thank you very much. Your questions have been coming in, and I'll try and group them together. Start with, and then perhaps as the conversation goes forward, it's a bit difficult having to use this online platform to get a discussion going, because we'd like to hear what you like to think as well as questions. But just going back to Jack's presentation, there were a set of questions around the issue of storage and the extent to which, what is the status of Rough? Could it be brought back online? How long would it take to build new storage? I think there are general questions there, but also linked back, in relation to underground storage that might be built to support blue hydrogen, for example. So how quickly could we get new storage, and how could it be useful longer term, perhaps?
Okay, so regarding Rough, for those of you that are not familiar, Rough is a former offshore gas field that was then first brought into use back in the 1970s. It was closed in the mid-1980s and converted into a gas storage facility, and was used as such until 2017, when the decision was taken to close it. Now, at the time the decision was taken to close it, because essentially these facilities degrade over time, right? And so it would have taken substantial investment to prolong the life of that facility, and it was decided that instead of trying to prolong the Rough facility, we would just rely more and more on this sort of just-in-time model of gas supply throughout the winter, with the rationale being that, okay, you might get the odd cold winter when you would pay more for your gas during the winter, but you might get mild winters when you would get gas relatively cheaply, and so it was seen as a bit of a bet on the weather for several decades hence. But I should also raise the point that Rough is actually quite a small facility. So the storage capacity of Rough is about 3 billion cubic meters compared to UK annual gas demand of about 75 billion cubic meters. So it doesn't make a huge deal of difference in terms of the UK seasonal supply. What it rather does, if you'll forgive the pun, is to take the rough edges off some of the volatility in UK winter gas supply. So the idea is that, for example, if one of the pipelines bringing Norwegian gas to St Fergus up in Scotland were to be taken down for maintenance during the winter, then Rough could be used to substitute for that. But it wouldn't supply the majority of UK gas demand through a given winter, let's say, in the way that some of the large-scale storage facilities in continental Europe would do. Now, in terms of storage for supporting hydrogen, one of the problems that we have is that anything that has, and I'm no engineer, I should say, I'm a political economist, but I converse with engineers from time to time. And one of the issues that we have is the storage of hydrogen in former facilities that were used to store natural gas, methane, is that you can actually, I don't know the best word for it now, I really don't want to use the word infect in the middle of this sort of COVID pandemic with Stefan sat next to me in his mask. But you can degrade the hydrogen by mixing it with any of the sort of latent methane that's left. So it can be quite tricky. To the best of my knowledge, there is only one hydrogen storage project that is sort of being proposed and developed at the moment. That is off the coast of Northern Ireland. But again, this is very much something that's in its infancy, let's say.
Just pick up the hydrogen loop, because there was a question for Stefan around are other countries allowing hydrogen-ready new gas boilers while banning traditional ones?
I don't know all the details. This is quite deep. This is going into a lot of detail. I think there's a lot of reluctance, and I know that based on a European Climate Foundation study that we did. There's a lot of reluctance even to ban gas boilers to begin with. And so what we're seeing is just a few exceptions to the overall rule. What is happening is rather, I think, a movement away from the financing of all of these solutions to begin with. I think generally hydrogen, and again, this is a very general observation, hasn't really entered the planning of the energy system when you go down to the level of particularly member states of the EU in terms of how that would come into an infrastructural future. There is just really no clear imagination around that, particularly because of the downgrading now of blue hydrogen even further. It just seems that green hydrogen is just so far off. There's just no clear path for it, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. So it's all a little bit abstract, and I think that's one of the reasons why what we're seeing is just exceptions to the rule. And I know, again, for this study that we did, in fact, we have seen a number of countries where there are entirely contradictory policies, and Greece is one of them, where in fact they're funding both gas boilers and they're saying they're decarbonizing. And gas is, yes, it is now in the taxonomy, but in a very specific way. So, yeah, I just don't think that. I mean, this is happening. What I was talking really about is sort of a direction of travel more than specific policies. But the tide is slowly turning. It's just that it's only happening in the wealthier regions of the EU and the more regulatorily, how shall I say it, regulatorily advanced regions as well. Yeah, I don't know if you...
Would you Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. So, of course, the major challenge with hydrogen is its production. And as Stefan rightly said, with green hydrogen through electrolysis, the problem that we face at the moment, of course, is very, very high electricity prices and the fact that we haven't built out our renewable electricity supply sufficiently to be in this wonderful sunny upland of having so much spare electricity from our renewables that we can then use it to produce cheap hydrogen. But then the alternative, obviously, is steam reformation of methane. And given the security of supply concerns that we have around methane at present, it doesn't look too good, really. I mean, in the UK, if we were to go down the hydrogen route for heating homes, retrofitting our gas boilers in order to make use of the pipeline infrastructure that we have, we're in a relatively fortunate position in that our domestic distribution pipelines were retrofitted over the past couple of decades. They're now largely polyethylene, so they're suitable for carrying hydrogen. I think there are still question marks maybe about some of the flanges and possible escape points, but theoretically at least the system is there. But as a caveat, hydrogen has only about 1/3 of the energy content of natural gas, methane, by volume, by cubic meter. So, of course, the question is whether the pipeline system would be of sufficient capacity if we were to go over to burning hydrogen in the place of methane. Now, of course, there is the option of blending hydrogen into our methane in order to lower some of our emissions, but that rather seems a lot of effort and expense for what would only be a marginal gain, let's say, in the reduction of emissions from household heating.
Okay, I've got questions and I've also got votes, so I'm going to ask the questions that have got the highest votes. Yeah, I know they have, but there's a lot more than is on the screen.
I just thought it's strange because you can't actually see.
Yes.
Well, I'm on here. And there's votes by them, and obviously you've only got 4 or 5 on there, so I'm trying to manage which one. So there's a question here which is relevant perhaps for everyone to have a view on. What, in your view, is the key factor holding back the UK government movement on domestic energy efficiency policies? Funding or what? I mean, we discussed this at length in UKIRK over the years. I mean, it is one of the criticisms of the UK strategy at the moment that there's not sufficient emphasis, and particularly in relation to gas demand. I remember Grant Shapps coming on the news and saying we didn't need to turn down our thermostats, and we've talked about it in UKIRK about the need for some sort of public information campaign. So where is the resistance, Caroline?
Yeah, it's hard to understand from my perspective because politically it seems to work on so many levels within energy policy, but then also between energy policy and other policy areas. So, but I was reading some insights from someone who'd left BEIS, who'd been very senior at BEIS, and they were saying that energy efficiency policy was seen to just not having worked, or not being a sort of an easy enough political win, and for it to be too complicated for this current government to find attractive in political terms. I mean, the idea seems to be that you need to promise something like easy and now, and well, I don't know where that fits with nuclear, but anyway. But you can see in terms of energy efficiency, we would all have to say, yes, please come into my home, and please allow my home to be disrupted for whatever period of time, and who's paying for it. And so I think they just see it as much less doable than you can make nuclear promises, and then most of those decisions will take place very far away from people who are voting, and they won't necessarily know what's going on. So I think it's that sort of level of politics of it.
Perhaps Jack could comment, because there was another question that talked about how much of a role can the demand side really play in reducing demand for gas during the winter? What can we do?
Well, now that I think it was Eon maybe that sent pairs of socks around to everybody and advised us to eat more porridge and cuddle our pets. I think, so the problem that we face is that, yes, UK gas demand is very seasonal. A lot of it is in the domestic household sector. And shy of turning down your thermostat, I think that the problem that the UK faces is partly that we have a very old housing stock, by and large. I know that there are lots of new build housing estates going up everywhere at the moment, but generally speaking, we have quite an old housing stock that is often poorly insulated. And so actually, I think to pick up on Caroline's comments, actually, I think that making sure that at the very least, houses have double glazing, cavity wall insulation, loft insulation, surely has to be the first step here. But it is quite, I think, it's quite difficult to convince people that actually they need to, sit in cold houses with 3 jumpers on for the good of the country. But with gas prices heading the way they are heading, I think plenty of people will be moving in that direction just by virtue of how much their energy bills are going up.
Megawatts, where do we get these megawatts?
Yeah, I was going to comment on, how we get the megawatts. Partly is also through the involvement of local authorities, primarily in the whole voluntary sector. I was delighted to see there is a session on that later in the day. I think one of the challenges with energy efficiency in this country, and it's not just here, is that post-austerity, there's been so much erosion of the capacity of local government, in particular, to work directly on the ground. And with fuel poverty, with megawatts, with retrofits, you need that frontline support, and that's just disappeared. And we had a big project that just finished here in Manchester where we looked at interventions, particularly among vulnerable people, and it's just vital that you have a whole ecosystem of actors. It's not even just local authorities. You need the voluntary sector, you need practitioners, and that's just, I think, one of the things that's holding back things at the moment is particularly that lack of governance and practice capacity on the ground. And also, I would say, and again, I've been sort of talking about this and drumming this all the time, but I think there's just also partly a lack of understanding of what needs to be done. And the politics is also mixed into it. But I think without that, because one of the immediate solutions that can be done, people have said this, is we can have collective solutions to the crises. We can provide community-based energy services. It's an unprecedented winter that I think we're facing. So out-of-the-box thinking has to come in if we're going to have a significant reduction in demand. And that does mean working within your community. And I just, that debate, I think, I'm struck that debate is missing. And again, working across different countries, I've only seen it in a few places. It's not the case that the UK is unique in that regard. Yeah. Sorry.
Mike, just to add to that, the fundamental question here is who pays, isn't it really? If we're going to reduce UK gas demand, particularly during winter, then it needs to be reduced in the household domestic sector. And the only seemingly viable way to do that at scale is with heat pumps. because I think that the issues that we've outlined regarding hydrogen make it somewhat difficult. But of course, the question is, who pays for heat pumps? And again, it comes back to Caroline's point of people coming into your house and interfering and digging things up, fine. But also, how much does a heat pump cost? Who's going to pay for that? And I would refer back to something that went viral, I think, last year, referred to as the Vimes boot theory, for those of you who are fans of Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels. There's one person in the audience smiling. I'm getting blank faces.
Another one at the back.
Essentially, it comes down to, if you are poor and you can only afford cheap boots with cardboard soles, you have to buy a new pair every winter because they leak and they degrade. But if you are a bit wealthier, you can buy some good stout leather boots that will last you for 10 years, and you will end up, over that course of the 10 years, paying only a fraction what you would if you had to buy new boots every winter. And so the thrust of this is that if you don't have the money to invest in, for example, a heat pump at the time of very high domestic gas prices, that you'll end up paying more and, by the Vimes boot theory, still have wet feet, as it were. So it's a question of who pays. Those that have the capital can afford to invest in this, but those who don't can't, and are currently trapped into paying high gas bills.
Hey, I think that's a good
Yes.
place to I think I'm cautiously optimistic that at least there's the hope that the current situation provides opportunities to accelerate progress. I mean, despite the short-term risks, which are undoubtedly there are concerns over carbon lock-in in terms of building new infrastructures for LNG imports and so forth. There were questions asked here about plans to develop new oil and gas fields and so on, but we really haven't got quite a chance to delve into that. I think many of the issues raised will be picked up in subsequent sessions. There's a session after lunch on nuclear, for example, but I think a lot of that we kind of foregrounded the geopolitical and political context within which we're discussing closing that implementation gap. And that maybe, hopefully, we'll get to the end of the decade and realize that this crisis did spur us on to greater opportunity. A cautionary tale, though, this is very much a Eurocentric view of the world. And it's a global carbon budget. And already there is plenty of example of the European Union exporting its climate insecurities, that countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan can no longer afford to import the LNG because it's all coming to Europe. And so we need to maintain that global context. I'm bound to say that as our theme is on UK energy in a global context, but hopefully we found that not too depressing. There was a question here, Jack, how expensive gas is going to be. I won't hold your feet to the top. But Ofgem is already warning the cap is going to go up another £600 plus. So, yeah, let's hope that sooner or later things will calm down. The gas market will rebalance, but not for a few years yet, unfortunately, according to the Oxford Institute. So many thanks for attending, many thanks for your questions, many thanks to the speakers. Hopefully that's got us off to a good start, and we touched on and drew out some of the issues that Niall also mentioned. So we have a lunch break now, and we convene at, I haven't got the programme, so what's it? 12:50, and we've got parallel sessions. So you need to look at the programme to work out where you need to be. Any other announcements from any of the organisers who aren't in the room? So, clearly not. So, Paul, nothing else? No, okay, so enjoy a lunch break. Thank you.
All right. Excellent.